Let's consider word choice. The glossary of usage is commonly confused words. We can find those in other places, but things like accept and accept, we'll look at those later. Wordy sentences is something that I want you to look at. It has redundancies, unnecessary repetition, but the first thing we need to look at is empty or inflated phrases. What it suggests, what your text suggests, is that rather than use a lot of words, you use a few. The idea is that you don't want to use more words than are necessary. So when you think about saying something, think about how you can say it quickly and concisely. And in the same way that we don't want to put empty phrases in there, we also want to simplify the structure of the sentences. If we can say it in fewer words, then we want to say it in fewer words. So rather than investigators were involved in examining, we can say simply examined. Instead of saying there is another, we can just say another module tells. Instead of saying it is imperative that, we can say night managers must. Again, the idea is that you want to use concise, precise language. W3 has to do with active verbs, and that means that you want to use verbs that express the action of the subject, as opposed to something other than the subject performing the action. If something other than the subject is performing the action, it's called passive voice. So the pumps were destroyed by a surge of power is passive. A surge of power destroyed the pumps is active. We can use a form of the be verb, was, but again, you want to have strong active verbs rather than have the action take place by something other than the subject in a passive construction, or to use a form of the verb be and it be more wordy. W4C addresses slang, regional expressions, and non-standard English. We need to be aware of the audience that we are speaking to, and the audience should always have appropriate language. You must choose appropriate language based on the audience. And in an academic setting, we don't use slang, we don't use regional expressions, and we don't use non-standard English unless we're letting a character speak. So we want to use academic language. If I've marked something as W4C, it may be something that you hadn't thought about as being slang or as being inappropriate, but we just need to be aware. In conversational language, many of these things are certainly acceptable, but the standard is academic language. The same is true with levels of formality. That is, academic language requires a certain level of formality. We are not to use contractions. We are not to use second person. I mark both of those as levels of formality. If you use the pronoun you in the middle of your paper, I may also mark it as a shift in person or in point of view. But either way, you need to be aware of what is acceptable and not acceptable in academic writing. No second person, no contractions. And then choosing, obviously, words that are appropriate to the situation. W4E is sexist language. Primarily, we need to be aware of how we communicate. Some things are considered to be sexist just by their very construction. But one of the things I want you to notice here is something they called outdated traditions. For me, the masculine pronoun was the, in effect, default pronoun. But now we have moved away from that. It is considered to be an outdated tradition. We may use them alternately. It's rather awkward to say he or she, him or her repeatedly. One option is to move to the plural, but then you have to be really careful about whether or not your pronouns and antecedents agree, but just be aware of the fact that using he as the default, that is, using the masculine pronoun as the default, is not acceptable in academic writing. W5E is exact language. Connotations are the meanings that we associate with words that are not in the dictionary. Be aware of the kinds of connotations that words may carry with them. Concrete nouns means we want to choose things that help us see specifically what, or allow our reader to see specifically what we intend. We don't want things that are vague. We don't want generalities. We want something that is specific. There are cliches and figures of speech, those things that we use over and over again and that have become rather tired or worn. Be aware of those. In the section W, it is about word choice, and it is about choosing words that are appropriate in an academic setting so that your audience is not distracted by the language that you choose.